Now, back to the Miracle Hunter on EWTN. Here's Michael O'Neill.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Miracle Hunter radio show on EWTN Radio. This is Michael O'Neill. I'm the Miracle Hunter. We talk a lot on this show about faith and science, and my book that came out not too long ago is called Science and the Miraculous, and I try to show the intersection of faith and science and how these things aren't contradictory. And one of the leading voices in this discussion, because we all know the common narrative or the thought is that you can't be a thinking person and a believing person both, that faith and science run head-to-head and are in contradiction to each other. But one of the leading voices to dispel this myth with numerous books out on this subject is Dr. Gerard Verschuuren, who's got a brand new book that's out. It's called Faith That Makes You Think. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Verschuuren.
Thank you. It's my pleasure for inviting me.
Well, it's always great to chat with you, and I think this is such an important this is an important topic because there is a perceived conflict between faith and science. And I think that many people think that you have to check your brain at the door or throw out all reason if you are to be a believer. What is, in your experience of when you run into this out there and your inspiration for writing these books, what is this conflict that's perceived out there?
Yes, nowadays that is the big story. It's the narrative that people want you to believe. They are usually scientists or atheists or, unfortunately, even some fellow Christians who are so focused on faith that they say there cannot be anything more than that. I always tell them, St. Augustine could not have said it more clearly. Believers are also thinkers. In believing, they think, and in thinking, they believe. That is so hard to believe for some people. They think if you don't believe, just think, or if you don't think, just believe. That cannot be true. There must be much more to faith. But unfortunately, faith is under attack. I said already, by scientists, by atheists, and by these faith people. I call them that faith people. Catholics are faith people too, but they have learned over the centuries that there is faith and reason. Pope John Paul II even wrote an encyclical about it, called Faith and Reason. Thomas Aquinas, a doctor of the Church, he says reason prepares the mind for faith, explains the truths of faith, and defends the truths of faith. What more could we wish for? We need them all. And that's why in my book I explain what the problem is of science and what the problem is of atheism and what the problem is of those faith people.
And when we talk about sort of this idea of checking our brains at the door or this don't think, just believe mentality, that kind of gives atheists a powerful weapon, doesn't it, to fight against those people who would like to think that faith and science can go together?
Oh, yes, a very powerful weapon. When those faith people say, don't think, just believe, atheists can say very easily, don't believe, think. And then that's why I spent a whole chapter at the beginning of the book about atheism, all the kinds of atheism there are. But I think most of them have been influenced or infiltrated by scientists. All the people who wrote these big books on atheism and there is no God and God does not exist and you cannot prove that God exists, they basically all say the same, that science shows us there cannot be a God. And that is awful. Science has a lot of limitations. So my second chapter in the book is about what science has come up with. And unfortunately, that is usually what I call nothing buttery. It says you are only a speck of dust. You are only a string of DNA. You are only a blob of cells. You are only a pack of neurons. You are only a glorified animal. If that were true, then there is no space anymore for faith, not even for reason. For reason comes from the mind. And scientists will say, no, reasoning and logic and all that kind of stuff, that comes from the brain. Well, I have news for them. The brain does not secrete thoughts like the pancreas secretes insulin. So there must be much more to the mind than just the brain. If we are just brain animals, we cannot really reason anymore.
We're talking today with Dr. Gerard Verschuuren, the author of the brand new book, Faith That Makes You Think. And it seems to me this book is actually written for, or it's maybe written for fallen away Catholics or lukewarm Catholics, struggling Catholics, or people who are considering maybe becoming Catholics. Talk about how that book addresses this crowd of people.
Yeah, it explains the basic things that we believe in faith, or in Catholic faith in particular. And some people have fallen away from that. So they have to be, how do I say that? They have to be re-informed. Instead of misinformation, they need good information. And I claim, sorry, I'm a little proud of that, but I claim that this book gives you good thoughts to think about things. It makes you think. Faith that makes you think. And if you don't think anymore, then there is no hope, I think. But if you think, and I'm helping people to think, whether you are an atheist, or whether you are a fallen away Catholic, or a flawed Catholic, you have to think again. And that's what I'm trying very hard in this book, to teach that and to show that. And when you come to the end of the book, I think you will say those atheists are wrong. They have the wrong information, and they attack faith as a straw man. It's not the real faith that they are attacking. And I have to explain that in the book, why it's not the real faith. So I want to show what the real faith is like.
We're talking today with Gerard Verschuuren, who wrote the book, Faith That Makes You Think. And it's an interesting journey through this book. And, of course, one of the challenges is that we can't just say to the non-believer, to the atheist, to the agnostic, to the science over faith person, you need to see this intersection between faith and science. You have to see that they're not contradictory. What is your philosophy or approach in this book, Faith That Makes You Think, to demonstrate in real ways that faith and science are not opposed?
I show that science and faith are actually reunited again. I explain why the famous Galileo case that people use that attack religion, they say that shows that Galileo was fighting the church. I show in the book that there are so many myths about Galileo, and I actually mention, I think it's 12 myths in the book that show that Galileo was the ideal scientist. He wasn't at all. He did some good science, but not in astronomy. He did that in physics and mechanics. He was good at that, but he was wrong. And especially the people who have all these myths about him were wrong when they tried to show that Galileo stoked the fire. He did, but he did it the wrong way. So what we need is we need to learn again that science and faith have been reunited. I am borrowing even from Galileo the distinction between the book of science, of nature, as he calls it, and the book of faith, or scripture. That is a good distinction. It's not his distinction, of course. There's so many things, he just borrowed things from other people. It's a very old distinction that we find already at the early Christianity. And it shows that we have those two books, and they can never contradict each other. Why not? Because they come from the same author, God. They can never be in conflict with each other. If there is a contradiction between them, then we have either learned the wrong thing from them, or we have taken the book of Scripture the wrong way, or we have taken the book of nature the wrong way. So they are both related to God. And there is a distinction how they deal with things. The book of Scripture tells us how the heavens go, and the book of nature tells us how to go to heaven. Sorry, reversed. The book of nature tells us how the heavens go, and the book of Scripture tells us how to go to heaven. So how do you have to read the book of Scripture? I give several examples in the book. I think the best one is about the creation account. If we read that as if it's a science book, then you are in for trouble. It's not a science book. Still, there are many, especially fundamentalist Protestants, that say, we have to take the Scripture literally, in that sense that it tells us how the world was created. 7 days? Yeah. In a way, that is true, but not the way a scientist understands that. So we have to tell people how to read the book of Scripture, especially that creation account. How do you deal with that creation account? And the book of nature tells us that our universe is 13 billion years old. Mm-hmm. That is a completely different time frame. Can those two go together? Oh, yes, definitely. And I show in the book that those two are not in conflict with each other. They tell us two different accounts from two different perspectives about the same event. God is the maker of heaven and earth, and we are created by Him. So we have, in God's image, we have a soul. And a soul is something that science can never touch upon, because it's immaterial. And that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Only scientists will say, if it doesn't exist, if it's not material, it cannot exist. So we can't talk about it. Yes, we can, but not as a scientist. And in the book I show how we can talk about the soul very easily, sometimes with some terminology, but basically very easily, that there is a soul, and if there is no soul, we are no longer a human being, but glorified animals.
We're talking today with Gerard Verschuuren, the author of Faith That Makes You Think. And I think for the modern atheist or agnostic, or perhaps young people who haven't embraced any faith at all, they're not necessarily thinking back to the Galileo affair. They may not even know of it. It doesn't bother them at all because they're too young to even have thought of that, or that's not what they're interested in. And perhaps they're not even interested in Scripture and understanding how Scripture can work with our understanding of science. They like to say, science proves that God doesn't exist, or at least there's no proof through science that God exists. How in this book and otherwise do you address this claim that there's no science that shows God exists?
Science, as I said, cannot prove that God exists. That is beyond its limits, its capabilities. So, but we can find signs in nature. We can find indications that there must be a God. How could there be any order in this universe? I think we all assume, at least scientists do, that there is order in this world. This world follows laws of nature. And with those laws of nature, where do they come from? To just say, they come from themselves, that doesn't make any sense. Nothing can explain itself by just referring to itself. So we need something beyond that. If God exists, then we can understand why there is order in this nature. If this world can be understood, if we cannot comprehend the universe, then it doesn't make sense to search in this universe. So there must be something that makes it understandable. Who or what did that? I have no other answer than God did that. There is a natural order in this world, and there is even a moral order in this world. We have to do certain things. So why is that all there? I have no other explanation than saying that it's because there is a maker of this heaven and earth. He explains why there are laws of nature. He explains why we can understand the world. He explains why the things are the way they are. As we say in science very often, why are certain things in science the way they are? There are certain constants in the physical universe that have a certain value. If that value would be a little bit different, we could not exist. Even simple water could not exist. If certain constants, the physical constants, were different, then the world could not exist. Even someone like Hawking, the famous astronomer, that he died not long ago, he had to acknowledge that it's very amazing that those physical constants have the value they have. So how do people explain that if they don't believe in God? Then they say, oh, there must be multiple universes. And we happen to be in the one that has the right constant in it, otherwise we couldn't exist. But
it is perhaps the most challenging argument that atheists and scientists have to deal with, this finely tuned universe concept that all these constants have to be just exactly right. This Goldilocks principle, you might say, where everything is just right so that life can exist. And if that's too complicated for them, they say, well, we're part of a multiverse where there are many universes out there. So they quickly try to skirt that one. Well, we're so grateful to you, Dr. Gerard Verschuuren, for your new book. The name of the book is Faith That Makes You Think. People can get it on Amazon.com and other places. Where can people go to find out more about your work, Dr. Verschuuren?
I have a website, and that website has, unfortunately, not an easy name. It says wheredowecomefrom.com, but you have to separate every single word by a dash. Where, dash, do, dash, etc. wheredowecomefrom.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This is such an important discussion, this intersection between faith and science, showing that they are complementary, that they go hand in hand, that they are not at odds, as many people would suggest. And these books that you put out, and you put out a number of them, this latest book is Faith That Makes You Think. Thank you so much for joining us on today's program.
Thank you, Michael, for having me on.
God bless. That was Dr. Gerard Verschuuren talking about his brand new book, Faith That Makes You Think. And wheredowecomefrom.com, with dashes in between all the words, is the place where you can find out more about his good work. We need to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll be looking at the question of the week. Stay with us for that.